Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Clarksburg, Massachusetts, March 2nd, 2017, evening. Joanne Ringer, 39, leaves home to start her first taxi shift in Easthampton and does not show. By the time the night turns over, there's no check-in, no arrival, no routine call to say she's running late. In communities like this, silence becomes a timestamp. Within days, a missing person file hardens into a homicide crime. This case opens with the clock. 6:00 p.m. is the scheduled start. She's expected to meet a dispatcher, begin the route, and call in when she's on the board. That call never happens. Later that night, family and employer try her cell. There's no answer, no return ping that anyone can verify. The first official push begins March 4th when the missing person report is logged. Patrol checks the Clarksburg residence and immediate surroundings. Basic welfare sweep, no forced entry flagged, no obvious sign of voluntary travel. Search expands fast. Mutual aid alerts go to Easthampton, Northampton, and surrounding jurisdictions. Officers ask a simple set of questions that drive the early hours. Did anyone see the car leave Clarksburg? Did any neighbor's camera catch a departure? Are there recent ATM withdrawals or quick purchases on her accounts? In the first pass, nothing obvious lands. March 6th, the break isn't a person, it's a location. Joanne's green Volkswagen Jetta is found curbside at Exeter Street and Parsons Street in Easthampton. It is a residential area, not her workplace, and she is not there. The vehicle is secured and photographed. State Police Crime Scene Services are called in. For the audience, that's a handoff from patrol to forensics. Standard when a missing person case shows signs of foul play or staging. The vehicle's placement, the surroundings, and what's left inside will matter later. For now, investigators document before they interpret. The timeline sharpens because of what's not present. Negative evidence. After the evening of March 2nd, there are no verified calls, texts, or social posts from Joanne. Family and employer have nothing to work with except the last known plan: start a new job and report in. In practical terms, that means any "I'm okay" transmission doesn't exist in the record. It narrows the window of whatever happened to that span between leaving home and the moment the car appears without her. As procedures spin up, investigators log contacts with friends and relatives, request carrier data for cell site analysis, and begin a canvass around Exeter Parson. The questions remain operational, not emotional. Who had access to Joanne's time and route? Who could move a car without drawing attention? Which cameras on that corridor were live on March 6th, and what do they actually show? In the words of one investigator, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean often means curated, an early signal to slow down and document every small inconsistency. This is where retention matters for you as a viewer. One person vanishes en route to a first shift. 4 days later, the car surfaces in a different town with no driver and no contact trail. If you were standing on that corner in Easthampton, what's the first detail you'd check? The curbside angle of the car, the homes with cameras, or the nearest street where a vehicle could be transferred quickly? With a vehicle but no driver, the body becomes the scene, and the chain of custody at the morgue will define what comes next. The investigation moved from roads and doorbells to a controlled room with bright light and numbered seals. Once recovered, the remains entered the custody of the Massachusetts office of the Chief Medical Examiner. The transfer was logged by time, handler, and container ID. Each seal number was read aloud, photographed, and recorded before any packaging was opened. That order of operations matters. If a case proceeds to court, a clean, unbroken chain tells the jury that what the lab examined is exactly what law enforcement delivered. Nothing added, nothing lost. Intake begins with condition and completeness. Technicians document clothing artifacts if present, soil and plant material, and any insect activity that could inform a rough post-mortem interval. Labels are applied to every bag and tray. A barcode links samples to the case number and to the single name that defines this file: Joanne M. Ringer. The tone in the room is procedural, not dramatic. A missing person is now a person with evidence attached, and that evidence must stand on its own. Radiography comes first. Full-body X-rays establish whether there are embedded foreign objects, surgical markers, or healed fractures that could support an identification. Imaging also sets a baseline for later analysis of perimortem versus postmortem change. The team notes the absence or presence of sharp force indications, ballistic signatures, or obvious perimortem fractures. In this case, decomposition limits what pictures can prove. That is not a flaw in the process. It's a constraint of time and environment. Next is odontology. Teeth are durable, uniquely patterned structures. They often decide identity when fingerprints and facial features cannot. A forensic odontologist obtains dental charts and radiographs from Joanne's treating providers. Point-by-point comparison is made. Crown restorations, root formations, endodontic work, and occlusal morphology. When enough concordant features align without unexplained differences, identity is confirmed. It's precise, it's conservative, and when done properly, it's powerful. Here, the comparison supports a formal identification of Joanne Ringer. Anthropology addresses what bones can say about trauma and timing. Examiners evaluate fracture edges, hinging, and color changes to determine whether an injury occurred around the time of death or long after, under environmental pressure. They also map out any skeletal asymmetries, prior healed injuries, or degenerative changes that align with medical history. In this file, the combination of elapsed time and outdoor exposure limits definitive trauma calls. There is no reliable mechanism of death that the lab can stand behind. The official language is careful. Cause of death, undetermined. For investigators, that doesn't end the homicide posture. It simply means the lab will not overstate what the bones cannot prove. Toxicology is attempted where feasible. Environmental leaching, limited tissue, and long intervals usually curb what can be drawn from preserved specimens. When results are inconclusive, that notation is entered and retained. The absence of a tox result is not a defense or a theory. It is a data line. Every movement of the remains inside the facility is tracked. When samples are cut for potential DNA confirmation, when microtrace is collected, when photographs are taken, each action generates a line in the chain of custody. Those lines are the spine of the case long after headlines fade. If the public asks why identification can take time, this is the answer. Accuracy has to win over speed. From a victim-centered lens, this stage restores name and legal status. Families deserve certainty, not conjecture. The identification anchors the timeline and permits investigators to change language from missing to deceased, with the dignity and procedural rights that follow. It also narrows geography. The OCME's report confirms the link between the recovery location and the person last known to be traveling toward Easthampton for a first shift. That link will be tested against phone records, vehicle placement, and statements in later chapters, but it begins here, in a room that records more than it speculates. For you watching this case, an undetermined cause can feel like a wall. In practice, it's a redirection. When biology can't narrate the final minutes, digital and behavioral evidence must. Think of the morgue as setting the boundary lines. Identity is fixed, the window of time is bracketed by last known contact and recovery, and any violent mechanism will have to be inferred from corroborated non-biological sources. The file does not get weaker because the lab is careful. It gets more focused. One line from an investigator resonates because it frames the next act. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes, that was the problem. Clean narratives often arrive when someone tries to anticipate the questions. The OCME's caution forces the rest of the record to carry the weight without shortcuts. The final administrative step closes with notifications to the lead detective and the district attorney's office. Copies of the identification letter and the autopsy/anthropology summary, redacted where required, are transmitted under evidence control. The working theory remains a homicide investigation with an undetermined biological mechanism. The science is conservative. The posture stays firm. With identity established and cause undetermined, investigators pivot back to the only controlled ground left, the car. And the curbside scene has to speak. Easthampton. Curbside at Exeter Street and Parsons Street. The green Volkswagen Jetta is photographed in place before anyone opens a door. The initial frames lock in orientation to the curb, wheel angle, proximity to driveways, and sight lines to any doorbell or porch cameras. Investigators work outside in, document, preserve, then examine. The focus is not on theory, but on what the car, the street, and the neighborhood can prove. Positioning comes first. The Jetta is slightly off-axis relative to the curb, subtle, but worth preserving in high-angle shots and distance markers. Tire positions are measured. If a vehicle was parked in a hurry, Compression patterns and the way the front wheels are left can help establish whether the driver stopped deliberately or coasted to a halt. Paint condition, license plate fasteners, and exterior handles are swabbed for touch DNA and latent prints. Tool mark checks along the weather stripping show no obvious intrusion. That absence is logged as negative evidence rather than assumed away. A car that looks quiet can still be staged. The only way to know is to record what is not there as carefully as what is. The cabin is photographed before contact. Seats, floor wells, center console, and any visible personal property. Inventory confirms items tied to identity and employment remained inside. For a new hire headed to a first shift, those items would normally travel with the driver. Here, they didn't. Seats and mirrors are measured against Joanne Ringer's reported height and driving posture. If the seat track sits outside her typical notch, that discrepancy becomes a working lead. Who adjusted it and when? The ignition position, key condition, and column plastics are checked for tampering. No pry damage is obvious. That too is captured as a negative finding. Microtrace collection runs in parallel. Vacuum lifts and tape pulls retrieve fibers and particulates from high-contact zones, the driver's seat, door cards, steering wheel rim, and gear selector. The point is not to guess, but to bank material for later comparison. If a third party handled the car, their fibers might be there. If the car sat in one place long enough, the sediment on the exterior could tell how long. Soil stuck to wheel wells or the undercarriage is sampled. If the car was moved from one environment to another, mineral content can help map that path when paired with known locations. The fuel level and odometer are logged to give investigators a ceiling on how far the car could have traveled since it was last known to be with Joanne. Those numbers don't solve the case, but they restrict the narrative to distances that fit the tank and the clock. Neighbors are canvassed on a tight loop. Officers ask for exact windows, when residents left for work, when porch lights triggered, whether any packages were delivered to create a timestamp. The request is narrow. What time did the car appear? Not, did you see anything suspicious? Residents with exterior cameras are asked for the precise capture settings. Several systems only hold short retention periods, so pull requests are immediate. Where no usable footage exists, that absence is logged to prevent later memory drift. A quiet street is helpful if it proves the car arrived outside typical traffic pulses. It is more helpful if one camera shows no car at a certain hour and the next frame shows it present, bracketing an arrival window. Inside the vehicle, the glove box and door pockets are checked for appointment cards, receipts, or parking stubs that could anchor movement. If a time-stamped receipt exists, it can test whether the car's story matches a person's claims later on. Air vents and seat rails are brushed for microtrace. If an unfamiliar fiber becomes relevant down the road, stored controls from the Jetta can accept or reject a match. The trunk is processed last. Hinges, weather stripping, and latch housings are screened for transfer evidence. The rule is simple. Everything reversible is reversible only once, so every step gets photographed, described, and sealed. Staging indicators are weighed carefully. The off-axis park, the personal items left behind, and the lack of visible forced entry are not conclusions. They are a cluster. Clusters become meaningful when they align with timelines and digital data. If the seat track sits outside Joanne's typical driving position and no one can place her at Exeter and Parson at the relevant hours, the staging hypothesis gains weight. If, on the other hand, a neighbor's camera places the Jetta arriving with lights on and a lone figure stepping away, the weight shifts. The team resists premature labels. According to contemporaneous reporting and police procedures, these observations are recorded as working notes, not final findings. From a human standpoint, this is where the investigation keeps dignity and discipline. The car is not a story prop, it is a container of fact. Recording what is present and what is absent gives the family something better than rumor, a list of verifiable conditions that will not change with memory. In towns like this, cooperation matters. A front door camera that holds 3 days of clips can make the difference between a 2-hour arrival window and a 20-minute one. If you live on a corner like this, would you check your archive when detectives ask, or assume it won't help? One line investigators keep in their notes recurs here. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean can mean curated. A car placed neatly on a quiet block with identity documents still inside looks organized in a way real emergencies rarely are. That observation does not accuse. It instructs the next step. The scene closes with reseals, signatures, and transport to a controlled facility. Evidence bags are labeled by location and sequence, not by what anyone thinks they mean. The processing team leaves with more questions than answers, which is the right outcome when the alternative is to fill gaps with guesses. What the Jetta yields now is a series of constraints on who drove, when the vehicle likely arrived, and how deliberate the placement might have been. Those constraints will collide next with signals from towers and devices. The next move is not on a map. It's inside carrier logs and camera archives. Within minutes of the vehicle scene being sealed, investigators send preservation requests to cell providers and draft subpoenas for call, detail records, and cell site information tied to the phones relevant to Joanne Ringer and her immediate circle. In 2017, this is the backbone. Who called whom, when, for how long, and which tower sectors handled the traffic. No apps, no live GPS, just the network's own footprints. Call detail records arrive with timestamps and UTC offset, numbers dialed, and durations. Parallel exports list the servicing cell sites and sectors, each panel identified by azimuth and sector letter. Analysts convert the time to local and plot sectors on a working map. Clarksburg and the towns due south along Route 8 and the Hill Corridor toward Easthampton. The first pass looks for ordinary behavior, recurring calls to family, a nightly check-in, short bursts to a new employer. The anomaly is the silence. After the evening of March 2nd, there are no verified outbound messages or calls from Joanne. That negative evidence doesn't tell where she is. It tells what isn't happening. She isn't reassuring anyone, and she isn't contacting the job she was supposed to start that night. Analysts then move from routine to conflict testing. A third party claims a Northampton meetup around the relevant window. The records don't back it. Cell site sectors servicing that downtown grid never show the phone attributed to that party at the time claimed. That's not magic, it's coverage. Each tower's sector has a limited arc. If your call or data session really happened at a coffee shop on Main, the sector facing that block usually sees you. Here, the sectors that do register activity place the device elsewhere. It's not yet a conclusion. It's a contradiction that will matter when statements are formally compared. Deletion behavior is the second pressure point. Examiners reviewing device images and account logs document bulk message deletions clustered near the disappearance window and browser history set to reduce visibility. Forensics logs mark these as working findings until they're paired with account-side records. In plain language, if hundreds of messages vanish from a handset, but carrier logs still show timestamps of sessions or message IDs, analysts can prove that something used to be there. That's not a motive, it's a pattern. When a life goes missing and digital content falls away at the same time, the pattern gets flagged. Municipal camera pulls complement the carrier work. Investigators canvass the Exeter-Parson neighborhood and the approach roads, asking for precise retention windows and export settings. Many small systems overwrite within days, so technicians clone any remaining clips as soon as owners consent. Where cameras show an empty curb at one time and a parked Jetta at the next, the arrival window narrows. Where cameras show no movement at all, that absence is recorded so no one later remembers a car that wasn't there. The aim is to build a ladder of minutes. What could have happened when given what the systems can actually document? Financial checks run in parallel. Detectives request recent activity from known bank accounts, payroll contacts, and any cards used by Joanne. Contemporaneous reporting does not indicate a flurry of withdrawals or purchases after she left for the shift. That matters because missing adults who walk away tend to spend gas, food, lodging, something. A clean ledger after the evening of March 2nd supports the view that she didn't continue on her own. It doesn't tell why. It limits how the story can be told. Analysts build a working reconstruction of the March 3rd daytime window using sector progressions that step south through the hill towns. A string of pings can reflect ordinary travel, but when paired with the later discovery of the Jetta in Easthampton, the sequence frames what is technically possible. If the phone attributed to a key person moves along a corridor that passes through Westhampton/Northampton, and then sectors serving Easthampton light up around early afternoon, that progression becomes a testable route. It does not prove who was driving or when the car was parked. It tells investigators where to look for corroboration. Receipt timestamps, A single surveillance hit on a cross street, the odometer and fuel readings already logged in the vehicle report. One limiter here is physics. Cell site is sector-level location, not GPS. Weather, terrain, and tower load affect handoffs. That's why analysts avoid bold pins on a map and instead draw cones for coverage. Inside those cones, they place and discard possibilities. The narrative tightens when multiple systems agree. A sector cone overlaps a camera that shows no Jetta at 11:40 a.m., and a second camera shows the Jetta present at 12:10 p.m. Now the arrival window is 30 minutes, not a day. That's the difference between a neighborhood rumor and a provable timeline. One more gap is logged with care. No confirmed communications from Joanne after leaving for the shift, and no emergency contact to 911 traced to her phone. People in genuine distress sometimes try, even briefly. The absence is not proof of anything by itself. Combined with the car's later location and the message deletions on a device associated with someone close to her, the absence amplifies the need to test alibis against network behavior. We keep this human, but we stay faithful to records. Families want a narrative that holds up under cross-examination. The carrier exports, the camera windows, the clean bank ledger. Each item is admissible if collected and documented correctly. Each also respects the person at the center by refusing to guess. If your town is watching, this is the part you can help with. Saving camera clips promptly, sharing exact times, and letting the data do the talking. In a homicide crime that begins with silence, precision is dignity. The digital packet closes with a short list of action items for the next team. Reconcile the sector contradictions with formal statements. Escalate for preservation extensions on any camera systems that still might overwrite. Cross-reference the tentative March 3rd corridor with fuel and odometer constraints already pulled from the Jetta, and package the deletion findings for prosecutors so they can argue materiality if obstruction charges come to court. The file advances here because something changes. We're no longer guessing where a person or car might have been. We're bounding where they could have been. That sets the table for interviews under oath, where words have to live inside the cones the towers drew. The interview phase opens with a narrow goal. Put sworn words beside fixed records and mark every mismatch. Within minutes of the digital packet coming in, detectives line up timelines, call sheets, and sector maps so that no claim stands alone. First, the spouse. In a recorded statement, Charles Chad Reedy says he last saw Joanne Ringer late morning on March 2nd and that she left to begin a new taxi shift. He reports her missing on March 4th. He adds practical details, calls he says he made, checks he says he performed, and questions he has about the Jetta. Investigators take that narrative and run it down point by point. Carrier logs confirm his phone activity windows. Some calls exist, but the content is not the issue. The timing is. When the phone associated with him interacts with sectors that don't match parts of his account, the inconsistency is flagged. A separate note records that in a later agency screening, he asked whether the Jetta's engine had been left running and whether he could get the car back. Behavior logged without commentary. The objective is to document what was asked and when, not to argue motive. Then, the third-party witness whose statements touch the Northampton meetup claim. She initially says she met or was supposed to meet Joanne around the window that matters. Detectives set her words against carrier exports. Cell site sectors that should light up near downtown Northampton do not show her device at the time she cites. Asked again, her account shifts. Asked a third time, it shifts further. By the time she sits with a prosecutor present, she acknowledges material false statements. That admission later resolves in court as a guilty plea to misleading police, but in the interview room, the work is simpler and stricter. Tie each claim to a timestamp, a location, and a corroborating record, or mark it unsupported. Every interview is transcribed with precise time notations. If a subject says, "I called around 7," the log prints the exact outbound call at 6:58 p.m., or shows no call at all. If someone claims they drove through Easthampton in the early afternoon and noticed nothing unusual, the team checks for plate hits, camera captures, or sector handoffs that put them in that area. Where records place a device in a corridor that could reasonably lead to Exeter Parson, that becomes a follow-up line of questioning. Where records put the device elsewhere, the transcript captures the discrepancy without editorializing. Deletion behavior is addressed without accusation. A handset tied to a key figure shows bulk message deletions clustered near the disappearance window. That fact is introduced as a neutral item. Our analysis shows a high volume of deleted messages between these times. Do you know why that would be? Explanations, storage limits, routine cleanup, a change of phones are recorded verbatim. Investigators do not speculate in the room. They simply note whether the explanation can be tested against account side logs, backup settings, and carrier metadata. Interviewers keep the questions narrow and the sequence fixed. Last face-to-face contact with Joanne, last call or text, any plan changes regarding the taxi shift, movements through the afternoon of March 3rd, knowledge of the Jetta's status before police made contact. They also ask about device access, who could have used whose phone, any shared accounts, any recent number changes. Answers that create new tasks, pull a secondary handset, verify a new provider, recover a deactivated number, are logged as action items with deadlines so nothing drifts. A short note addresses a polygraph screening administered to a key figure. The report is recorded as a preliminary investigative tool. It is not proof of truth or guilt. Interview strategy never treats it as more than context. What moves the needle are the fixed points. Joanne has no verified communications after the evening of March 2nd. The Jetta appears in Easthampton within days, and statements by at least one third-party conflict with carrier records and later resolve as admitted lies. Across sessions, detectives keep one discipline: do not feed interviewees details they can mirror back. If someone is guessing about the Jetta's ignition or parking posture, they are allowed to guess into the transcript, and the transcript later meets the vehicle photos and worksheets. Accuracy is earned, not hinted. For the audience, this is the quiet part of a homicide crime, not dramatic but decisive. A strong case is built by pinning speech to systems, clocks, towers, cameras, odometers. Where words and systems agree, confidence rises. Where they diverge, prosecutors get leverage and jurors get clarity. Families get something else: less rumor, more record. The final move today is procedural. Transcripts and exhibits are packaged for the charging review team with a clean index, date, speaker, claim, corroboration, yes, no, and follow-up task. The next chapter shifts to procurement and planning, what was acquired or prepped before March 2nd, and what behavior after suggests staging rather than surprise. From sworn transcripts and plotted signals, the file moves to charging math: what could have been filed, what was filed, and how agencies divided the work. Prosecutors start with elements. For a homicide charge in Massachusetts, motive isn't required. Intent and causation are. Here, identification is confirmed, but cause of death is undetermined. That narrows the pathway to a circumstantial build. Opportunity windows, contradictory statements tested against cell site records, a vehicle that appears without its driver, and deletion behavior around the disappearance window. If Charles Chad Reedy were alive, a likely posture would have been a circumstantial homicide theory supported by digital movement contradictions and corroboration from neighbors, cameras, and vehicle processing. Without a medical mechanism, the state would lean on timeline compression and behavioral inference, not character, but documented acts that suggest knowledge and control after Joanne's last verifiable activity. Because the named prime suspect is deceased, charging pivots to ancillary crimes that impact truth-finding. The most direct lane is misleading a police officer under Massachusetts law, material falsehoods that obstruct an investigation. That lane was used against Laura J. Riley, whose statements about a Northampton meetup conflicted with cell site footprints and changed under pressure. She later admitted misleading police and received a state prison sentence. In practical terms, that conviction does two things for the record. It validates the materiality of the digital timeline and codifies that at least one narrative offered to investigators was false in a way that mattered. Warrants and subpoenas follow a predictable spine. Investigators seek SCA orders for call detail records, cell site sectors, and account metadata. Search warrants target devices and cloud accounts. Municipal camera owners provide exports under consent or order. Each demand is logged with scope and time range so that later, in suppression litigation or appellate review, the state can show necessity, particularity, and good faith reliance. Where two district attorneys' jurisdictions meet, Berkshire, Clarksburg, and Northwestern, Easthampton, Hatfield, Massachusetts State Police Detective Units bridge the line. One homicide posture, two counties. That inter-DA coordination matters because identification came through one corridor while early timeline work ran in another. A single narrative file is assembled so the public hears one story with consistent place names and dates. Charging theory also evaluates obstruction via deletion behavior. Prosecutors don't argue that deletions equal guilt. They argue that bulk message deletions aligned to critical hours are conscious acts that deprived investigators of material leads. To make that stick, they tie handset-side gaps to carrier-side artifacts, message IDs, session stamps, and to specific interviews where a witness claimed memory that conflicts with the surviving metadata. That turns a technical observation into a trial exhibit with probative weight. Where the law allows, a grand jury may be used not to indict a deceased suspect, but to preserve testimony under oath, lock down custodian certifications from carriers, and admit business records cleanly. If a living person later challenges the integrity of the timeline, the state can point to sworn custodian testimony rather than a paper affidavit. This is part legal strategy, part respect for the victim. The record should stand on its own, regardless of who is available to face charges. Interagency logistics stay visible but low friction. Crime Scene Services manages physical exhibits from the JETA. OCME provides identification and anthropological notes. Local departments maintain contact with families and conduct neighborhood recanvasses when new time windows emerge from the digital team. The District Attorney's Victim Witness Unit coordinates lawful updates without compromising evidentiary posture. No rewards, extraditions, or cross-border actions are asserted here because none are necessary to explain the documented steps. The human side is not decoration. It's a principle. Families don't get closure from speculation. They get it from a file that can survive motions to suppress and appeals years later. When a homicide crime revolves around silence in a parked car, the route to accountability is paperwork done right. Precise language in warrants, tight time windows in subpoenas, and statements that match what the systems actually recorded. This phase closes with a charging memo that reads like a blueprint. Admissible foundations, identification, vehicle processing, cell site contradictions, ancillary counts already resolved, misleading police, and a clear statement that the prime suspect is deceased, limiting prosecutorial options on the homicide count while keeping the investigation status open for any accessory or evidence tampering conduct that can be charged and proved. Next, the courtroom filters, admissibility, and motions decide what the audience and a jury would be allowed to hear. With charging theory framed, the file enters the courtroom filter. What evidence a jury would actually hear, what gets limited, and what never comes in at all. Prosecutors start with the backbone records. Call detail and cell site logs are offered through carrier custodians as business records and authenticated under routine procedures. Massachusetts courts have long required judicial authorization for historical cell site, so warrants and return inventories are attached to defeat suppression on privacy grounds. Mapping experts are qualified to explain sector coverage and limits. They do not place a phone on a doorstep, and the testimony is kept in that lane. When a witness's claimed Northampton meetup conflicts with sector arcs, the state argues material inconsistency, not precision geolocation. That distinction keeps the testimony inside the science and protects it from exclusion as overstated. Surveillance clips from the Easthampton neighborhood are authenticated by the system owners or by officers who perform the exports. The state lays a chain from device settings to the exact export time and shows that retention windows required prompt pulls. If a camera shows the curb empty at one time and the JETA present at the next, the clips bracket an arrival window and are admitted for that limited purpose. Any gaps are addressed directly. The court prefers transparent limits over speculation. Vehicle processing is admitted through the Crime Scene Services technician who photographed, swabbed, and sealed. The testimony is clinical. Orientation to the curb, no visible pry damage logged as negative evidence, micro trace collection, seat track position. The state avoids the word staging unless the court first allows an inference instruction. Otherwise, the observation stands on its own, and the jury is left to weigh it with the timeline. Morgue findings are streamlined. A forensic odontologist confirms the identification of Joanne Ringer. An anthropologist explains why cause of death is undetermined given elapsed time and exposure. No mechanism is suggested beyond what the report can defend. Courts accept careful science. They punish reach. Statements face their own tests. Admissions by a party opponent would be permitted if the prime suspect were alive, but he is not. For witnesses who are alive, the state uses prior inconsistent statements for impeachment when the transcript and the record diverge. Where a witness has already pleaded guilty to misleading police, that conviction may be used to show bias and credibility issues. The court keeps the charge separate from the homicide posture so prejudice does not swamp probative value. Deletion behavior is offered with guardrails. Examiners testify that large volumes of messages were removed during a critical window and that carrier-side artifacts show prior activity. They do not testify to motive. They testify to conscious acts that affected investigators' ability to recover content. The state may request a spoliation or consciousness of guilt instruction if the court finds a foundation that deletions were purposeful and material to the inquiry. If granted, jurors may, but need not, draw an adverse inference. If denied, the fact of deletion is still background that explains investigative steps without an instruction. Defense motions predictably target cell site reliability, surveillance authenticity, and scope of warrants. On cell site, the court hears about tower load, terrain, and handoffs. The expert concedes limits, and the court permits sector testimony with no claim of pinpoint accuracy. On authenticity, the court requires the original export or a verified clone and consistent metadata. Any breaks in chain go to weight, not automatic exclusion. On warrants, the court checks timeframes and particularity. If the state stayed within the four corners, the returns stand. Polygraph references are excluded by default. Investigators can describe interview sequencing, not the result of any examination. One additional lane is consciousness of guilt evidence beyond deletions. False statements, especially those already adjudicated as misleading police, are admissible to show a person's state of mind when confronted with the investigation. The instruction is measured. Jurors may consider deception as evidence of awareness, but must still decide whether the totality proves any element beyond a reasonable doubt. That nuance matters in a homicide crime built on circumstantial pillars. Finally, the court sets boundaries for victim impact and family testimony at any sentencing related to accessory counts. Those statements do not prove elements. They recognize loss and the investigative burden borne when silence and manipulation stretch the timeline. The admissibility phase ends with a trimmed but sturdy set of items: carrier logs with proper warrants, sector explanations with limits, camera windows that bracket arrival, vehicle processing that records conditions without overreach, forensic identification with code undetermined, and witness credibility that can be tested in open court. What cannot be proved is not argued. What can be documented is allowed to speak. Next comes the public-facing status, what the court ultimately accepted, what charges reached judgment, and the single ending line that closes this file with precision. The legal process in Joanne Ringer's disappearance could only go so far. Her husband, Charles Chad Reedy, was identified as the prime suspect but died by suicide in April 2017, weeks after she vanished. That removed any chance of a homicide trial. Prosecutors turned instead to Laura Riley, an Easthampton woman linked to Reedy, who admitted she lied about her contact with him during the critical window. Her false statements forced investigators to waste valuable time. She pled guilty in 2019 and was sentenced to 2 to 4 years in prison for misleading police. Forensic testimony established Joanne's remains through dental records, but the medical examiner could not determine a cause of death because of decomposition. That limitation, combined with Reedy's death, meant no murder charge could be filed. The official record remains: disappearance in March 2017, her car abandoned in Easthampton, remains identified in Hatfield a year later, and a suspect who never faced trial. Court filings emphasized how crucial accurate statements are to investigators. False leads not only obstructed justice but also delayed answers for Joanne's family. The case stands as a reminder that in small communities, when time is lost in a violent crime investigation, the truth may never be fully recoverable. Remains recovered, cause of death, undetermined. Looking back on Joanne Ringer's case, I can't help but feel the weight of how fragile trust and safety can be. Her story reminds us that silence, lies, or delays in a crime investigation can erase precious chances for justice. As a narrator, I share this not only as a report but as a lesson. Speak up, protect one another, and never underestimate the signs of danger close to home. What do you think? Could stronger community awareness have changed this outcome? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next true crime story that matters.